Okay, I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome all of you. This is we're a little lighter in attendance than we are sometimes, but we're competing against the University of Arizona football. There was early release today at noon because of the football game. And usually we have a lot of students from classes who come, but this time I think tailgating won out over the Buddhist Studies lecture. But anyway, I'd like to, first of all, I'd like to make note of our sponsor, the Kensey Foundation. This is the third year of our Kensey Foundation lectures, and we have a very kind of soft spot in our hearts for Kensey Foundation, because in some ways they were the ones who initially got the ball rolling for us for the Center for Buddhist Studies with the lecture series. So we're now in our third year. That was the first thing. Then they have gone on to help fund the Center for Buddhist Studies, and particularly the Hangzhou Buddhist Cultures project. So we want to especially acknowledge their ongoing support. Tonight's speaker, Charles Muller, is an academic specializing in Korean Buddhism and East Asian Yogacara, having published numerous books and articles on these topics. He currently teaches at the University of Tokyo. He is one of the earliest and most prolific developers of online research sources for the field of Buddhist studies, being the founder and managing editor of the online digital Dictionary of Buddhism, the CJKV English Dictionary, and the H Buddhism Scholars Information Network, along with having digitized and published numerous reference works. The Digital Dictionary of Buddhism and the CJKVE Dictionary have become basic reference works in the field of Buddhist and East Asian studies. They are subscribed to by universities around the world. His work in the area of online reference works and digitization led him into the field of digital humanities, with his principal areas of expertise lying in the handling of literary documents using XML and XSLT. It was in 2008 that Professor Muller was invited to move to the University of Tokyo, where he teaches courses in digital humanities, Chinese philosophy, Korean philosophy, and religion. And I've known Professor Muller for quite a while. We go back quite a ways. But one thing I learned new about him, that he was always A.C. Muller. And I learned out that we have something in common, that he has his first name is actually Albert. Something new. Anyway, I guess I didn't have a good enough middle name to retreat to my middle name as you did. But anyway, please join me in welcoming Charles Muller, who's going to talk about Yong toward a more thorough understanding of the essence function. Please, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert, for your kind introduction. I got here a day early because of trying to manage flight arrangements with Delta, and so I had all day off yesterday, and I got around the town a lot. And I used Uber a couple of times, and it got hot in the middle of the afternoon, so I went into Target and I bought a hat, which happened to be a Wildcats hat. So when I got into the Uber cab, the driver was very excited, and he turned on the Wildcats radio station, so I got filled in on everything that's going on with the game tonight, but it's too bad I had to compete with it. So Albert thank you for your kind introduction. Albert has kindly introduced my important work in the field of digital humanities and Buddhism. But So when Yong first asked me to do this talk, and I gave him the topic, Yong wrote back to me. He said, "I didn't know you did this kind of stuff." And actually, my interest in Buddhism, especially East Asian Buddhism, is in Buddhist philosophy. And that's always been my motivating force in my development of resources, was so that I could read these texts as well as possible and make what I learned available to others. And I've, almost all the books and articles I've written deal with the core issues in East Asian Buddhism, as well as Confucianism and Taoism. My graduate school training went very much into those areas. And so, sometimes you get known for something in your career, and that defines you, and you can never escape that, as hard as you try, but that's fine. So, let's see, go here. So, essence function. So I define as a distinctive traditional East Asian way of interpreting the world, society, events, phenomena, and the human being that allows any single phenomenon to be viewed from two contrasting, yet wholly contiguous and mutual containing aspects. One is a deeper, more fundamental or inexpressed aspect called in Chinese Ti, and in Korea Che, Japanese Tai, usually translated into English as essence or substance. And I'm going to get into those translations, so don't be bothered if you don't like one of them. And second is a visibly manifest or superficial or secondary aspect called Yong. In Korean also Yong. In Japanese, in Chinese philosophical studies, it's pronounced Yo. In the Buddhist studies, pronounced Yu. I usually stick with the Buddhist rendering when I talk in Japan, because I gave a talk one time to a small group of scholars, and I was saying Tai-yo, and I realized after about 15 minutes they thought I was talking about the sun. So after that, I usually stick to you in Japanese. And it's translated into English, no problem, translated as function or activity in which their unity is emphasized. And that is the very, very important point to understand about this concept, and the point that is most missed in Western scholarship to date. You can call it a paradigm. It's also a type of archetype. It's a hermeneutic tool. It's used for metaphysical categorization, ontological categorization, seen from a Western perspective. We see it this way, that is distinctively East Asian. It's not seen in Indian, Tibetan, Southeast Asian Buddhism, nor in Western philosophy, religion in any significant way, used in the same way. Of course, you can find equivalent words, but it doesn't serve in a paradigmatic fashion in those traditions. It is also a tool for analyzing personal spiritual practice, authenticity, martial and fine arts, and it is actually through this approach that I became first interested. And if I hadn't become interested from this approach, probably would have never continued to pursue the academic aspect. And if I have time, I hope to get back to this toward the end. So first, it is the most ubiquitous structure of discourse found in Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Taoist alchemy, from the 5th century BC up until the 18th and 19th century. But the amount of work that's been done on this concept is almost nothing. A few Japanese scholars have done some good philological work, and some people in their dissertations that dealing with the awakening of faith or texts like that have touched upon it. But usually in passing, and it regularly mischaracterized as an East Asian dichotomy or polarity, where it's used, limited in its scope to being seen as a metaphysical principle or an ontology, as Yong understands it. Not that he's wrong, but it's a very narrow understanding. Rather than being a dichotomy, it is mainly used to demonstrate unity between two things that might otherwise be seen as separate or of being in unclear relationship. Its usage is flexible. It's flexible, defying simple ontological or metaphysical layering or emanation that would be the way it's usually perceived by Western scholars, but rather being mainly about various perspectives of priority according to the circumstance. This point is superbly argued by the Korean Neo-Confucian philosopher, a giant named E. Twege, who I'm going to be talking about more toward the end. Most important for me as a hermeneutical approach from my time in graduate school is that it avoids the extremes of the modern essentialism and the postmodern flattening out or despiritualization of meaning, instead retaining spiritual depth with flexible adaptation. I came out of I majored in Korean Buddhist text, East Asian Buddhist text, but I came out of the Comp Lit program at SUNY Stony Brook, which was in the late 80s and early 90s, one of the hotbeds of postmodernism. And Derrida used to come on a regular basis, and so essentialism was an evil word that we had to deal with from time to time, but you had you had two alternatives: essentialism or deconstruction, and this paradigm goes between the two. So, lacking a clear parallel in Western philosophy and religion, so when we use the terms essence and substance, it's already problematic. It's because of the baggage, philosophical baggage attached to both of those. Substance means to stand below, already implies layering, and essence is used in Aristotelian and Hegelian philosophy with specific meanings, and people are bothered by that. But when I use essence, I use it in a common sense word that's given in dictionaries, such as the most significant element, quality, or aspect of a thing or person, one that possesses or exhibits a quality in abundance, as if in concentrated form, like the essence of perfume or something that spreads out. But when we translate, we have the danger of creating confusion. So my mentor, Professor Sung-Bae Park of SUNY Stony Brook, who introduced me to this concept, got into trouble in the 80s and 90s when he would talk, and people. I was at a presentation one time where a Tibetan specialist got up and shouted, "There is no essence in Buddhism." So he kind of got freaked out, and he retreated to the Korean vernacular terms of mom and momchit, which mean body and gesture, and it applies well, body and its movements. But by doing that, nobody knew what he was talking about, and so so John Macon is adamant it has to be substance. Essence is wrong, and Brooks Zipporah just sticks with T. Yong, and I understand that too. But if you just stick with T. Yong, then you're limiting the reach of your audience. So I use essence, but I usually clarify the way in which I intended, and I won't argue about which one is better. So Pre-coinage, so it's a paradigm first. The term itself is not designated until around the 3rd century in China, but the analogous archetypical patterns can be seen going back to as far as the 5th century in the Li Ji, Yi Jing, and so forth, especially in such forms as roots and branches, stillness and movement, and others. And this passage is, to my mind, one of the most critical, instrumental, influential passages in all of East Asian philosophy for Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. So the idea that the quiescence, stillness, is associated with purity, sagehood, and movement is when any kind of movement has the possibility of descending into problems and chaos. And this kind of model is precisely the format of the awakening of faith. For those of you who know about this is exactly what the awakening of faith talks about: the mind of thusness and the mind of arising and ceasing, and so forth. So this influence goes, and this kind of this is seen in Chan interpretations. And I'm not the only one to identify this passage. The Japanese scholar Hirai Shune, Twege, many people identify this passage as being one of the most critical for indicating the origins of East Asian philosophy. And as the expression, so the T is the essence is associated with the stillness, and of course function is associated with movement. So in Neo-Confucians, later on, Neo-Confucian scholars would widely understand the basic Confucian mention structure of being with Ren at the center, and the five eternal expressions as being the function. So when you meet somebody for the first time, you don't know if they're good or not, but by their behavior, you can eventually see. I have a dentist friend who tells me it takes 6 months to know if somebody's. So the innate goodness and wisdom manifests itself as propriety, manners, as filial piety, loving one's parents, as fairness, as discernment, and as trustworthiness, and many other besides, but these are the basic 5. In Taoism, we can see the paradigm in the pairs of Tao, the essence and function, and the Pu and Qi. And, those of you who study Taoism know that this Pu, the uncarved block, is the origin of the bear, Winnie the Pooh, who's a simple character. A.A. Milne was a student of Taoism. Black and white, the black in East Asian thought is usually like a Japanese kuroto. The black indicates experience, depth, and white is superficial, and so forth, thick and thin. It's implicit in the Chuangzi, with function depending on perspective. The gnarly trees are no good to the carpenter, but they're great for the picnickers who want to camp out underneath them, and so long. Chuangzi is filled with these kinds of distinctions in function for one single thing. The term is thought to be coined first by Wang Bi, a Confucian commentator on the Taoist texts. Now, people say Wang Bi, everybody says Wang Bi is the first one, and as far as I can tell, he's the first one to use it thoroughly and systematically. Professor Funayama has written an article indicating that it has earlier origins, and I think he's right, but still, in terms of clear systematic usage, this is the first time it's applied as a hermeneutic to analyze all these other Taoist pairs that I mentioned. So in the transmission of the Buddhist canon that in the early stages, when texts begin to be translated into Chinese, commentators begin to use this as a way of analyzing Buddhist ideas. And I'll skip the Hongmingji, which has a lot of discussions about essence and function, but most importantly, people like Jizang and Jury apply the term profusely and create other new analogs. And the most important is Jizang, who uses it as a tool for explaining the relationship between the Buddhist two truths. Because the two truths in Buddhism are always in danger of being taken as a binary way, as a dichotomy, as being separate. And the essence function Yong formula is a way of combining them to make one, so to make the conventional truth the expressed aspect of the ultimate truth. Or also here, the idea of stillness and motion applies. So conventional truth means the use of language and so forth, where ultimate is beyond language. And this, in addition to the stillness and movement aspect of Yong, this, for Buddhism, this very clear expression of ultimate and conventional is pivotal and influential throughout the whole remainder of the tradition in East Asian Buddhism, and will be later picked up by the Neo-Confucians. So, matured signification. So, as the understanding of Buddhism develops, 6th century, the Chinese and East Asians and Central Asians begin to write text directly using this paradigm. And the presence of this paradigm as the organizing principle of the awakening of faith is, to me, one of the strongest arguments for the strong East Asian influence in its provenance. Whether exactly who wrote it where, you just can't deny this. This is what sets it apart from the other Indic texts of the period. And of course, later exegetes such as Wonhyo analyze such things as the mind of thusness and the mind of arising and ceasing in terms of essence and function. And again, this is a manifestation of the stillness and movement expression. So for Mahayana, the Buddha nature is the essence, and the same Buddha nature can function well in the activities of the Bodhisattva, but poorly in the activities of the regular people. So Buddha nature itself is interpreted as through this kind of paradigm, through the awakening of faith and other texts. But not just in native East Asian texts. So even Yogacara commentators who are working with Indic texts, so somebody like Wonchuk will say that the eighth consciousness, the alaya vijnana, is essence, and that the other 7 forthcoming consciousness are function. And Vasubandhu may not have agreed, but this is the way it's taken in East Asia. And it's not only Wonchuk, Kweiji will say the same thing. And in the Kamakura period, very influential Japanese Kanjin Kakumusho, the author uses essence function extensively to explain Yogacara concepts. The peak of philosophical development of the paradigm is seen in the development of Huayan Buddhism, where the analog of Li Qi, principle and phenomena, becomes pervasively used. And each analog of the paradigm expresses a certain kind of nuance that in a certain situation. But the world of phenomena represent existence. It represents conventional truth, which is a function, and the world of principle is understood to be emptiness and the ultimate truth. But most important and true to the meaning of essence function is not for so much for distinction, but to ultimately bring them back together. So non-obstruction between principle and phenomena means that the sacred and secular are not to be seen as two things, and that there's priority for being aware of essence, there's priority for being aware of spiritual practice, but a person must be able to function in the world. And so, you can't be a mystic and cut yourself off from the world. You have to have both. You have to have function to actualize the essence. I had the opportunity in graduate school to study with one of the leading Sufi scholars of our generation, named William Chittick, and he told me a story about a Sufi hadith that he thought expressed this, which was so the story goes that it's in Arabia, and the student is on his camel and going to see his teacher on his camel, and he goes to his teacher's house, and he goes inside for instruction, and he leaves his camel outside. And after he comes out, the camel is gone. So the student goes back in and tells his teacher, "My camel is gone, my camel is gone." So the teacher said, "Well, did you tie it up?" And the student said, "No, I had faith in Allah." So the teacher said, "Have faith in Allah, but don't forget to tie your camel." So this kind of, so Dr. Chittick, he said this is all throughout Sufism, same kind of understanding. So Sufi sage is somebody who can do both, who can handle both, who knows how to prioritize the mystical reality, but who can function in the world. So that's a kind of story. That's a kind of example what it means in terms of analyzing personal behavior. Now, ideas originate in China, ideas about essence, function, and principle and phenomena, but they, in terms of deep philosophical, what we might even call theological discussion, they really get worked over in great detail in Korea, both in terms of Buddhism, by people like Won-hyo and Chino, but also in terms of later on the Neo-Confucian doctrines of Chushi and so forth also have get treated in incredible detail by Korean scholars. So in Korea, everybody knows this. Every scholar is more than any East Asian culture I've been in. Cheong is a well-known concept. And then for the Platform Sutra, which everybody knows, it becomes a pivotal organizing structure. So meditation, the Platform Sutra has a very important passage that says meditation is essence and wisdom is a function of that. So, and you shouldn't mix the two up. You should understand the priority, but you should also understand that one goes with the other. And again, this is, the meditation is stillness, and the wisdom is the motion. So again, stillness and movement. And this is a kind of recent discovery of mine. So Western people who treat this tend to see it usually ontologically or metaphysically from kind of I feel like a kind of Platonian view. But I think that in East Asia, it is stillness and movement is the most important component of that, and we should not be too quick to turn it into metaphysics, or to a kind of layered metaphysics or ontology, before appreciating that dimension. So it becomes a standard component in Chan discourse. Albert knows about this very well. So, and now it's changing. It's not so much a textual hermeneutic, but talking about the behavior, a way of evaluating the behavior, authentic or not behavior of a Chan master whose great function, which is something very simple like washing one's bowl or chopping wood or carrying water, but fully displays essence of the person that is fully embodied. So also in the Confucian tradition, you could have function that truly manifests the essence, and you could have function that does not manifest the essence. Like in Japanese, something called keigo is very important, polite speech. And sometimes when people use keigo to you on the phone from like insurance companies, it's kind of disgusting to listen to. But when keigo is used by somebody who really means it, and somebody who's deeply steeped in the culture, it's beautiful. So there's this idea of function reflecting essence and function not reflecting essence, which Neo-Confucian philosophers will pick up with Ren and various manifestations of it. So it's the virtuosity of Chan behavior. So this is a behavioral application of the paradigm rather than simply textual. So after 7 centuries or so of this kind of development in the Buddhist tradition, some Neo-Confucianism appears, and the Confucians take it back. And now it's gone through all this development through Jizang, through the awakening of faith, through Chan, and this is the perfect tool for the Neo-Confucian philosophers to re-examine the Mencius and the Analects and the Confucian body of literature, and they do so fully using this paradigm, especially the Chung brothers and Chushi, and use the term. Chushi himself uses the term Yong extensively, but more importantly, they come up with the notion of principle and material force, Li Ji, which is clearly inspired by the Huayan Li Shi. No article written by a Confucian scholar will mention this. Well, Jushi didn't mention it, and neither did the Chung brothers, right? So why should they? But so the study of East Asian Buddhism, separate from the study of Confucianism and Taoism, it's dangerous because of the importance of the mutual influence, and it's important to know each other's traditions. So Chushi uses Yong in articulating the relationship between the 4 potentialities. Many people translate directly as the 4 sprouts and the 7 emotions. So the Sutuan are the 4 beginnings of human morality that Mencius teaches in 2.6, Mencius 2.6 of Ren, humaneness, of Yi, justice, of Li, propriety, and church, the wisdom, discernment. And so Mencius says every person possesses these four kind of seeds. And then other texts like the Doctrine of the Mean and other Confucian texts say that people have 7 emotions: desire, hatred, so on and so forth. And so somehow these four roots, these 4 seeds in human psychology turn into the 7 emotions. And the 7 emotions can be harmonious. They can arise to the right level. They can be applied in the right way, or they can be troublesome. So they take the 4 potentialities as essence, and they take the 7 emotions as function. But the problem is, at what point do the four potentialities become the 7 emotions, and what it is and what is the relationship with them? And Jushi opens up this discussion, but it's the Korean Neo-Confucians who really take this up in full force later on. And I'll get back to that. Also, in China, Song China and Ming China, and more importantly in Korea, this notion begins to appear. Now, this goes back to Zongmi in the 8th century, of the 3 teachings being one, Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism being unified at some basic level. But again, it's mentioned in China and it's used a little bit, but the relationship in Buddhism, between Buddhism and Confucianism in Song and Ming China, is never quite as confrontational or problematic as it is in Korea, because in Korea, the Goryeo dynasty is a Buddhist state dynasty. And the key factor in the change one of the key factors in the change from the Goryeo to the Chosun was the ejection of the Buddhists from power and the installation of Confucianism. And that period in between, for the 30 years before and 30 years after the change to the Chosun, was a period of intense scholarly debate. Buddhists were on the defensive, and Confucians picked up important Buddhist texts like the Platform Sutra and the Sutra of Perfect Enlightenment and criticized them. And Buddhists had to, but the Buddhists were all educated Buddhists had gone through Confucian schools and Confucian colleges, so they knew Confucianism intimately. So the first way that Yong, the essence function, is employed in Korean Chaeyong is in the framework of this intertradition debate. So the Buddhists are debating with the Confucians, and the reason they can engage in debate with each other is because they both take essence function as their underlying logical framework. So Buddhism is an expression of some kind of truth, and Confucianism is a discussion of another kind of truth, but they both sides accept this as their underlying framework. So the most famous Confucian scholar of the period, Zhong Dojun, gets into a debate with his one-time graduate student and turned Buddhist monk, Kiwa, and each one of them in their exchange accuses the others of not properly understanding essence and function, of inconsistency. And this is the theme I take up in my 2015 book, the Korea's Great Buddhist Confucian Debate. So they accuse each other of inconsistency, and other debates among Confucians and Buddhists in this period are also all based. So this is in Indian early Indian philosophy, the Buddhists debated with the other Indian schools of Buddhism, and they could do that because they shared the same Indian worldview. They shared the idea of karma. They shared the idea of transmigration and practice and so forth. So they shared the same vocabulary, and this is the basis for the sharing of vocabulary between these two groups. On the other hand, later on in the Chosun, this becomes the hermeneutic principle for positing the underlying unity of the three teachings. So very important monks such as Yong say they create a hermeneutic structure, kind of like a Panjiao system that says, well, Confucianism, and a lot of this comes out of Zongmi, that Confucianism is an elementary teaching, and Taoism is intermediate teaching, and Buddhism is the final teaching. But they accept they accept Confucianism in their system as a necessary and useful teaching. And this is the Buddhists are on the defensive. So this is a way of mitigating. It's a kind of way of mitigating the trouble that they're facing, but at the same time, it becomes pervasively used. And Yong is also the same monk who gathered the army of Korean monks to fight against the Hideyoshi's invasion, and was critical in the defeat of Hideyoshi's army. So Yong himself had both sides. So they understood. I'm sorry, I forgot to include English for none, but the Buddhism and Confucianism and Taoism are all considered functions of kind of shared truth of purity or holiness or something like that. And like I said, this did start in China, but in Korea, it's worked out in great detail, with treatises being written on the topic. Finally, the most advanced treatment of the problem of the advanced usage, detailed usage of the paradigm, is it becoming the cornerstone of Twege's thought. So Twege and the different disagreements between Twege and his opponents can be analyzed in terms of how they understood the basic meaning of the paradigm, whether they tended to understand the mind from the Che or Yong perspective. So Twege, following Chushi, to a certain degree, explains that the four potentialities are essence, and the seven emotions are function. But where exactly the shift comes, and how soon do the seven emotions arise, and so on and so forth, becomes a topic of debate. The 4-7 debate originates when Twege, who is the leading Confucian scholar of his generation, in his 50s or 60s, receives an arrogant and accusing letter from a young scholar, almost 20 or 30 years younger, named Kobang, who attacks Twege's understanding in a rude way. And Twege has a Confucian, even now, if you get the letter attacking you from a younger scholar, you can do what you want with it. But in those days, as a leading figure in this Confucian system, he could have destroyed him. But instead, he politely accepts the challenge and takes up the discussion with Kobang. And the series of letters that go back and forth between the two develop into this incredibly rich philosophical debate. And in the end, they don't arrive to an agreement, but they do arrive to some kind of mutual understanding. Okay, we'll leave it here. And this debate is later taken up in the next generation by another pair of disciples. So it goes on for a long time. Then finally, in the modern period, you can find this used in modern Korean Zen Buddhism, and I don't know of any Japanese Zen teacher who does this, but Sungbei Park, who was my advisor, was a Buddhist monk, a Zen monk, Sun monk for a long time under this great master Sungchul, and he was introduced to Yong as a teaching technique by Sungchul as a way of of reconciling one's inner world, inner mind, with the external reality of the world. And so in Sungbei Park's book on the Mumchi paradigm, I'm paraphrasing here, he said, Buddhist suffering is none other but the difficulty of reconciling the expectations of our inner minds and the experience of the external world. And I was met by a young lady here who's studying, the young lady who took the selfie. She wrote to me a few years ago telling me she was struggling with reconciling her Buddhist practice with scholarly academic activity, and she asked me if there was any way, and I said, well, I had the same problem. So I came into Buddhism as an adamant Zen practitioner, and it got me in a lot of trouble. It got me in trouble with people, and when I went into graduate school, I didn't know what to do, and so Sungbei Park taught me this paradigm as a way of reconciling the two things, that they don't need, that doesn't need to be. So he said the obstruction is in your own mind, and after that I didn't have any more problem with this, kind of like a Zen story, right? But this kind of tool, it can be used. So, but this is an extension of, I believe, of the behavioral model that you see of authenticity that you see in Sung period Chan, and it's also the Zen master with all of the trappings and manner, but is he authentic or not? You can't tell by looking at the outside. So, the trying to see the inner person is what this is about. So, having worked on this, I've been writing articles on this since graduate school, here and there, and most of the ideas that I presented to you, I had already come to on my own, but 2 or 3 years ago, I'd never found a full essay treatment of the topic by any East Asian scholar. Chu Shi mentions it, and people mention it here and there, but nobody really goes through the whole thing. And I found this excellent piece by Twege, and if any of you are teaching Buddhist philosophy, classical Chinese reading courses, and you want to find a good text, very well written and very stimulating, this is online in the Korean classics websites. But Twege gets another letter from a young scholar who critiques, who tells him that the mind does not have essence and function. And so this is Twege's counter-argument to that. And he picks, all of the things I wanted to find somebody else who said, he said, first of all, essence function should not be perceived in rigid ontological, metaphysical, or dichotomous terms. It's something that's applied flexibly according to each situation. And also that Chaeyong should not be limited to, Chaeyong is a Korean pronunciation, of course, that to situations where the actual terminology appears. So he understands it as a rubric for a pattern that informs the East Asian view of inexpressed, static, fundamental, that is always contingent on its expressed motive and superficial. And so in the first part of this text, Twege identifies the 5 most originary tropes of Chaeyong, arguing that the paradigm was functioning in these ancient works, even though the term doesn't actually get coined until the 3rd century. And he says this specifically. So he finds it in the stillness and responsiveness of the I Ching, as the stillness and movement in the Li Ji, which is the passage I showed you at the outset. The idea of unmanifest and manifest in Zhi Se, that's, of course, the doctrine, his commentary to the doctrine of the mean. The taking of the human nature and its feelings as essence and function that comes out of Mencius. This is the origin of the 4-7 debate. All of these examples, all of these are examples of essence and function of the mind. This is a quote from Twege. And finally, so he says there are 2 distinct aspects to it. One is that is applied to the discussion of concrete things, such as a boat can ride on the water, a carriage can ride on the land, and the water and land that carry the boat can be called essence. And Jushi himself said, metaphysically speaking, that which is intangible is definitely essence, and that which is apprehended in the realm of concrete things is regarded as function. But if we speak in terms of the physical realm, then concrete things can also be essence, and the principle that they reveal can also be function. So we can't just generalize and say that the metaphysical is essence and that the 5 universal relationships are function. And this statement by Jushi counters almost everything said by Western scholars on the this topic in their glosses and footnotes. So the Great Learning has a very famous line that says, things have their roots and branches. Affairs have beginning and end. If you know what comes first, and you know what comes last, then you are near the way. So, know what your priorities are, and everything will be sorted out. That's what I had to say today.
Okay, we have time for questions.
Professor, it's very inspiring, especially the last quotation from the Great Learning. Knowing the priority is principal rule for living a good life. I'm very impressed with the part with the diagram of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism as the application, the function of one purity. Would you define that purity as the Buddha nature or something else? What is the...
A Buddhist would. A Taoist would say it's the Tao. And a Confucian would say it's Ren.
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 Ren, yes.
Right.
Thank you very much for presenting this very fantastic and excellent presentation. A few comments,
Microphone.
I have a few comments or suggestions for your further, explanation. Like the Chen brothers and Zhu Xis, talking about the 7 feelings, etc. You are very critical and point out that's influenced by Huayan Buddhism. That's exactly the case. But actually, it's directly inherited from Li Ngao in Tang Dynasty. Li Ngao is a student of Han Yu, which at first against Buddhism, right? And Li Ngao has a very famous book, the book of the Resurrection of Human Nature. Actually, he's also deeply influenced by the Huayan Buddhism. And in his book, the 7 feelings, the same word appear in Fuxing Shu in Tang Dynasty. So a lot of the scholars thought that Qing brothers and Zhu Xi is directly inherited by it. This is the first suggestion.
Okay.
And the second one is about the Wang Bi. You talk about the Wang Bi, the Ti Yong. It's very good, good point. But Wang Bi is a scholar which is deeply, researched, deeply studied Taoism, the Tao philosophy. In fact, in Zhuang's more than one chapter, is talking about 无用之用. The no use is the big use, right?
Yes.
And like in 逍遥游, the untrammeled traveler, and 人世间, a lot of actually in very early days in Qing dynasty, at that time already inspired people on this aspect. The third one is about, you talk about the 原则 and 会计. 会计 about the eight concepts is the essence, and actually this should be looked from the angle of the four tierings of two truths. 会计 has developed a system. Actually, he was inspired by Jizang, the three tierings of two truths, and then he developed based on the Yogacara Bhumi Sastra and Cheng Wei Shi Lun, translated by Xuan Zhuang, his teacher. He developed a system of four tierings of two truths. Actually, I used this system to explain the Heart Sutra. And so, actually, the eighth consciousness, as we can say that the essence of essence. Like, I appreciate very much when you talk about the Hua Yan, you talk about the conventional truth and the ultimate truth. I always use that instead of essence. The ultimate reality, ultimate truth, means sunyata, emptiness, eventually. But when we say that the eighth consciousness is the essence, it means it's on the phenomenal side. On phenomenal side, the eighth consciousness, especially specifically the alaya, is the essence of phenomena. But alaya itself is also part of the phenomena. It's the relation between the seeds and the phenomena. 种子 and 现行. 现行 means the arising. Arising, the function arising of seeds. Just another layer of essence and function. So it's different layers. The ultimate layer is the sunyata. So that's why Kuei-ji developed into four tiers of two truths. There's a few points for your reference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. I'm aware of the line that you cited from the Chuangzi. In the future, I will include that. And the other points also are very useful. And if I ever find the time and energy to turn this into a book, I certainly want to include those points. I know also about Dushun's. There are a lot of things. There, also in Chen is just loaded. The host and guest, and it's just in Chen you just find endless examples of this more than anywhere else. But thank you very much. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Robert Gordon here. I teach here at the University of Arizona. Question for you: is there a way to understand the paradigm? Is there a way to understand the paradigm, the Yong paradigm that you mentioned, in architectural terms? Because one of the things that I study is sacred space, and is it simple? Is this simple? You talked about a little about sacred space, but is it embedded in the architecture as much as it is embedded in the trifold expression of the three philosophies?
So, due to time limitations, there's a whole other aspect of this talk that goes into applications in terms of, I'm a long-time martial arts practitioner, and also, so this paradigm can be used extensively, and also in the fine arts. But in Japan, the art of ikebana, flower arrangement, tai-yo is a technical term, where the tai, it doesn't have exactly the same meaning, but the tai refers to the center of the arrangement, and the yo refers to the outer part of it. So, but it clearly comes from this tradition. And I don't know, I'm not familiar with the history of architecture to know if somebody used this terminology in East Asia in regard to architecture, but it would not surprise me at all. Chinese medicine is aimed at not curing the external symptoms, but getting to the root of the cause, and so on and so forth. So I would certainly, I have no doubt that it could be applied in the field of architecture, and it would be interesting to find, text that talked about that.
That was a really interesting question. I was going to ask something totally different, but I was thinking actually I think it's up at Frank Lloyd Wright's house in Phoenix. Actually, when you enter in, he has a quote from the Tao Te Ching on the wall that's all about this, how architectural, how the where you have form, but the emptiness that makes the structure too. So there's actually something really interesting there. I'm always curious about how where he he just sort of put up this, I forget which chapter of the Tao Te Ching it is, but I just have a vague memory of it. Thanks, that was really interesting. I think this comment here proves your point about the paradigmatic structure. You find it everywhere. I mean, we could all sit here and think of different examples of it as well. So would you mind just walking me through a little bit, though, how this isn't something akin to Plato? I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on it, because I see I can understand maybe a reason, because you had a lot of slides at the beginning just saying there is no equivalent in anything in Western philosophy or anything like that, and I'd just be curious how you draw the line there between, because it also matters how you take Plato's forms or ideas and all of that as well. I think there's one reading of Plato that might get fairly close to it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it, because you seem to have thought it through, so thanks.
Yeah, so if we did an East Asian interpretation of Plato, we would probably use this, right?
Yeah. Actually, I know there was a book on translating Aristotle into Chinese, but I don't know if anybody ever did it for Plato. How did they do the
the basic answer to that would be what I just presented from Twege, in that Plato's idea and the form, it's a fairly set unit. You know what I mean? It's emanatory, and the essences are eternal, right? They're ideas, and so the Buddhist dependent arising works very well with this, because Buddhist dependent arising would do what it takes to deconstruct any kind of permanent underlying idea or essence, right? And so, of course, Confucius, Chuanzi would also, with his critique of language, would also say that, would show that everything can be turned on its head, and that so that's the problem with that, and also the way it functions throughout the rest of Western philosophy is not in this kind of way. It's more towards dichotomizing and so forth. So it certainly bears similarities. A specialist in Aristotle pointed out to me a year or so ago that it would, in terms of Aristotle, it would be closer to not essence, but form, and I forget. But so yeah, you can find pieces here and there in Western thought or other kinds of thought that bear similarity, but they don't inform the system, the philosophical system, in the way this does.
You mentioned 熊十力, but before 熊十力, Zhang Zidong, applied this theory to Chinese learning as essence and Western learning as practical use. Yeah. And there were a whole body of literature on this subject. And in the end, the people say, well, it's nonsense, because Chinese learning has its essence and has its practical application. Western learning has its essence and application. So what you're bothering with. And then meanwhile, Chinese are arguing about this. the Japanese, they did the westernization very successfully in their Meiji Restoration. And the Chinese scholars were still arguing about this.
So, Chinese philosophers under the influence of Western philosophy, I believe, often misapply this. And with Yong he turns it completely into an emanatory ontocosmology. And then this, the famous Chinese model of accepting Western scientific thought, but keeping Chinese tradition and calling that Yong. Well, that's I don't know if that's really that's really acceptable from the understanding of the tradition. But still, the reason they're using it is not to distinguish. I would say the reason they're using it is not to distinguish them, but to provide a way of unifying them in a harmonious way, even if it's kind of a tricky device. But that's what they're trying to do with it. They're trying to find a way to reconcile the Western learning with the Chinese tradition, and so that people can accept, okay, we can do this. We keep that on the edge, on the outside, but that's not our true inner nature. So that's the motivation. Whether, I know about those kind of late developments, and so that's why I try to stay out of that part.
Thank you. I'm interested so in comparison with the Indian Buddhism. So there is no such a distinction between T and U. But in India, I think there is for Samanya Lakshana and Siva-Lakshana, these two are very important, concerned with the essence.
Right.
Samanya Lakshana is a kind of a principle, eternal, to be applicable to everything in the world. Siva-Lakshana is the here and nowness. So this kind of contrast, very important, and Buddhists accept these two simultaneously in their own arguments. So I'm wondering if we apply this distinction in India to your understanding, how will have you?
So, since my early fascination with this paradigm and my studying of Buddhism, the part I wanted to treat most is the intersection of Indian Buddhism, the philosophical intersection and the pivot between the two. And where is that? What Indian model comes closest to this that could act as the bridge? And probably that would be it. I mean, and conceptually, I think that would fit into the paradigm. The main point would be it's not as important for Indian Buddhists, right? As for the whole system. Like the Samanya Lakshana is important, but it's not. In my title I said it's not so soteriological in the same way it is in East Asian Buddhism, right? So that I think that's the main distinction I would make, and that's the problem that Yong has with interpreting, with using the paradigm. He takes it also. Well, this is not the same as what you brought up, but he takes it as a strict ontocosmology and doesn't understand the soteriological dimension. So I guess that would be, but it would certainly be the kind of thing that would come closest to matching. And if I wrote in full about this, this is something I should certainly want to discuss.
Sorry, I'd like to take the floor and ask a question myself, if I could. This is coming in from a slightly different direction. I was reading something by Hoyt Tillman the other day. He's a Song Dynasty Neo-Confucian scholar. And I don't remember who it was, but it was, I'm pretty sure it was the 11th century. He made a reference in passing to, well, not just Yong, but there was a third element that he would refer to a thinker that used T as essence and then Yong as application. And this is in a political context, so it was looking at it in terms of maybe public policy, but also in the middle, or a third one as literary, culture. So my question isn't really regarding that particular application, but since you've looked at this a lot, have you seen that any place else where they play with the Yong model and introduce a kind of a third element, not as an application, but a third category, so to speak?
In the Awakening of Faith, T-Shang, they put character Lakshana in between T-Shang, Yong. In the Buddhist and Confucian and Taoist tradition, that's the only case I've seen. I haven't seen anybody apply it in the modern context like that. But I mean, I think it's perfectly legitimate to do that, some kind, because it's not binary, it's not either or. There could be some kind of transitional middle, and that's the problem. In the 4-7 debate, they're debating over where that middle is. Basically, the whole thing is about the middle to the one side or is the middle to the other side. But I don't know.
So the Tiantai folks don't pick this up, and then because you can with the Kong Jia Zhong or Kukaksha, I mean that was the first thing that came to my mind.
I guess so. I guess so. But I think that really trying to deal with Madhyamaka issues there, but I guess it could fit into that category. But when Jerry uses the term specifically T-Yong, he uses it as T-Yong, and it's like 2,000 times in all of his writings. So, but certainly the process of sinification that occurs in Tiantai is a big part of it. So even the three truths, I guess so, would be worth consideration. There was a question there.
Thanks. So it looks to me, just at first sight, that essence is contradictory to the idea of dependent origination. And didn't anybody in Chinese, all this history of Chinese philosophy, argue that?
I tried to make the point not to get too much hung up on the translation of the English word essence in terms of its strict Platonic or Aristotelian. So the essence in this system is understood as being dependently arisen. So it's not an unchanging, immutable something. It's not an Atman, it's not a Brahman. It's whatever it is, it's something that's been created by all kinds of surrounding causes and conditions. That's what. So, and Buddhists in this context would understand that. And so the East Asian understanding of the concept T is not equivalent to our Western concept of essence. It's just that in order to get this discussion outside of the realm of Chinese philosophy specialists, I use the term essence, but it can't be understood like that.
Okay, but that's a very common translation of it. Yeah. I've seen that everywhere.
Yeah. So there's aside from substance, there's some people translate it as body, and a lot of times in some situations that might work, but it doesn't get you anywhere in terms of philosophical discussion.
Yeah.
So every time I write an article about this, in the first paragraph I have to explain or have a footnote next to essence explaining that I mean, and I give, some Merriam-Webster's definition of essence rather than.
But I feel like it's also where the Neo-Confucians, I haven't read the Taoist stuff, but it seems to be where the Neo-Confucianists are actually pushing it. To me, that's where when we say they're like Sangyang Bui, but the Neo-Confucianists, I think, are pushing towards that actual understanding of essence as some kind of eternal thing.
I don't see that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, nobody argued it. So that's an important.
The conception of Yong, doesn't it have the potential of sort of just indiscriminately validating the status quo? Meaning, it's the way society is with all its injustices, inequalities. Well, that's just Yong. I mean, so what are you gonna do about it? It's just that's what it is. And so how does the idea of Yong function in terms of, I guess, progress, as problematic that word is, and how do we go beyond the realm of saying, well, that's just another aspect of Yong or T or whatever that might be?
It's not just Yong, it's bad Yong. and there's a distinction. It is to be corrected. And the way to correct it is to approach it two ways. The way to correct it is to approach it is to settle your mind and do meditation, but also go out and vote. That's right. And don't use plastic bags.
I think maybe we'll call it close here. I want to thank Charles Muller again for a great talk and a great discussion. It was really good. So let's give him another round of applause.